Imagine losing everything in an instant. In a single day, your life, your dreams, and everything you knew disappear, leaving only emptiness. But what no one expected was that, against all odds, one person decided not to give up. What happened after this tragedy? How could someone rise from such a deep fall? This is the story of someone who found strength in the darkest shadows of pain, and instead of succumbing, emerged stronger than they ever imagined. Prepare yourself for a journey of overcoming that will challenge everything you think about resistance and resilience. There are moments when life transforms abruptly, as if the ground suddenly opens beneath us. 1 second, everything seems in its right place. The routine, the people we love, our plans and dreams. The next, it all disappears without warning, leaving us with nothing but emptiness. What once seemed certain is torn away, and we are left standing, confused and disoriented. This is the day that Clara never imagined she would live through, the day that would change her life forever. The morning started like any other. The sun gently filtered through the window, the streets were bustling, and the sounds of the city grew louder as the day went on. Nothing, absolutely nothing, suggested that tragedy was about to strike. Clara was in her home, doing what anyone might do, making coffee, listening to some soft music, enjoying a moment to herself before the day's responsibilities took over. She had no idea that this simple moment of peace would be the last she would experience for a long time. It came in the form of a phone call. The voice on the other end was grave, urgent. At first, Clara couldn't comprehend the impact of the words she was hearing. In that instant, reality felt distant, as though it couldn't possibly be true. But it was. There's been an accident. It's serious. You need to come right away. A sinking feeling spread through her, a terror so deep it paralyzed her, unable to make sense of what she was hearing. What had happened? Who was in danger? Who had been affected? She drove, her hands trembling on the steering wheel as she sped toward the hospital. The traffic, the noise, the world outside, everything felt distant, like she was moving in slow motion, unable to grasp the reality of it. Her heart pounded in her chest, her thoughts racing, trying to understand what had happened, what she was facing. She thought of how everything could change so drastically. How could this be happening? How could something so sudden tear apart everything she had known? When she arrived, the sight of the hospital hit her like a punch in the stomach. The white walls, the cold, sterile lights, the unfamiliar faces, and somewhere in the background, the muffled sounds of frantic medical staff, all felt foreign, unsettling. Clara stepped inside, disoriented, led by a nurse who, with a somber look, escorted her to a room where everything would be revealed. The scene before her was dark. Loved ones, people she cherished, were there, injured, in danger, and she could hardly believe what was happening. What had occurred couldn't be real. But there it was, unfolding before her eyes, like a nightmare becoming reality. And the question that kept hammering in her mind was, why is this happening? Hours seemed to drag on, each one more painful than the last. Clara tried to remain strong. She tried to find hope in the smallest things, but tragedy, relentless, swept through her every thought. She wanted to scream, to cry, to go back to a time when everything was fine, when life was simple and predictable. But all she had was that cold, sterile room, the smell of antiseptic, and the unbearable waiting. And this is where many give up. When the pain feels unbearable, when the world seems to have no meaning. But Clara didn't know yet what her life had in store for her. She didn't know that this tragedy, this day that changed everything, would also be the beginning of a journey that would make her discover a strength she never knew she had. The days following the tragedy dragged on, as if time had stopped, but the emptiness inside Clara seemed to grow with every second. What once seemed to be a full life, filled with conversations, laughter, and shared moments, was now weighed down by an unbearable silence. She tried to speak, tried to find the words to express what she was feeling, but everything that came out of her mouth seemed empty, meaningless, disconnected. The pain inside her was so deep that words couldn't reach it. They simply vanished into the air, as if the sound itself were absorbed by nothingness. In that house, the echoes of what had once been her family life reverberated off the empty walls. The dinner table, which had once been filled with chatter and stories about daily life, was now silent. The couch, where everyone piled up to watch that show they all loved, was now just a place where nothing remained but bitter reminders of what had been. Lost. The sounds of the house, once so familiar, now served as a constant reminder of the emptiness that had taken its place. Clara tried to force herself to make sense of it all, but she couldn't. There was no way to fill that hole. The words from those around her, the comforting phrases she so desperately needed, felt farther away than ever. "I'm so sorry. Everything will be okay. She's in a better place." They echoed, but they were like the wind, without weight, without depth. It was as though no one could really understand what was happening inside her, as if no one could comprehend the extent of her pain, and Clara didn't know how to explain it. How could she put into words something so indescribable? She walked through the house, her movements mechanical, trying to find something familiar, something that would make her feel like there was still normalcy. But everything was different. Everything was strange. The smell of coffee in the morning, which once brought her comfort, now only reminded her that this day would not be like any other. The corners of her house, once so full of life, now felt soaked in a profound sadness, something Clara didn't know how to shake off. She tried to do simple things she used to do without thinking, but nothing seemed to work. She felt as if she were trapped in an endless cycle. Wake up, try to breathe, try to think, try to find a moment of peace, but everything felt hollow, an endless void she couldn't escape. The loneliness was suffocating. She didn't know what to do with herself. Conversations with friends and family seemed like more of a burden than a comfort. Their words of encouragement, their hugs, their promises that everything would get better, only made her feel more isolated, more distant. She felt like she was in a silent prison where the pain was not shared, but lived alone, like a cruel sentence with no end. At night, when the house finally fell into complete silence, Clara would sit on the couch, staring at the blank television. She couldn't find comfort in the lights from the street or the stars visible through the window. The darkness outside seemed to reflect the darkness inside her. She wanted to scream, to tell someone how she felt, but the words never came. All she felt was an immense pain, a crushing emptiness that filled every part of her being. The tears that used to come so easily were no longer there. It was as though her soul had emptied itself of any capacity to feel anything other than pain. The weight of the silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of pain unsaid. It was the space between each breath, the time suspended between each heartbeat. It was the suffering of not being able to share what she was feeling, of having to carry the burden of loss without anyone truly understanding how it was destroying her from the inside out. Clara felt like she was sinking deeper into that emptiness. She tried to distract herself, but the silence always found her, always reminded her of what had been lost. And in that silence, Clara wondered if it would ever end, if the weight she carried on her chest would ever lift. It was as though each memory was a sharp knife, cutting deeper, deeper into a wound that seemed impossible to heal. Every thought pulled her back to that day, to that moment when tragedy had reached her, and she wondered if she would ever find the strength to move forward, to accept that the emptiness was a part of her now. But not all of her. It was impossible to know. But Clara was still there, in the silence. She was still alive, and for some reason, that still meant something. She just didn't know what yet. The following days seemed to drag on endlessly, as if time itself had slowed down. But Clara couldn't seem to find a way to move forward. Getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain. Every step, every action seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. She was drained, physically and emotionally, as if the weight of the world were on her shoulders. The pain was overwhelming, and every part of her body, every fiber of her being, screamed to stop, to lay down and give up. But somehow, she managed to rise, her legs trembling beneath her as she stepped into the bathroom. She looked at her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Her eyes were dull, her face pale, and the weight of grief seemed to hang on her like a heavy cloak. The woman in the mirror seemed like a stranger, someone who had once been full of life, full of light, and now stood broken and fragmented. The physical exhaustion was a mirror to the emotional exhaustion she felt. Clara couldn't escape the feeling of being overwhelmed, as though every step she took pulled her deeper into an abyss. She had no idea where to go from here, or even how to begin to heal. The sense of uncertainty about the future, about her own life, seemed to paralyze her. The pain in her chest, the constant ache, was a reminder of everything she had lost. And yet, there was a small, persistent voice inside her that whispered, "You have to try." Clara didn't know where this voice came from. It wasn't loud, it wasn't forceful, but it was there, pushing her to take one step, then another. She didn't feel ready. She didn't feel capable, but somehow she couldn't ignore it. The thought of giving up was almost too tempting, but she couldn't give in to it. She had to try. Her first real attempt at moving forward came when she forced herself to take a walk outside. The world, still going about its business, seemed so distant to her, like she was an outsider, looking in. She dragged her feet along the sidewalk, her mind clouded with despair, when she noticed the small things she had once ignored. The birds singing, the breeze gently swaying the trees, the soft rustle of the leaves. It was all there, happening around her, and for a brief moment, she felt a connection to the world again. But then the doubts came, rushing back. What's the point of all this? Why even bother? The walk didn't bring the answers she was hoping for, but it was a start. She kept moving, one step after another, as if the act of moving forward in itself had some kind of healing power. She felt her muscles aching, but somehow, the pain felt different. It wasn't the overwhelming pain of grief. It was the pain of someone pushing through, of someone not giving up, even when everything inside her screamed to stop. Each day, Clara found herself taking small steps, tiny actions that required all her strength. She made a cup of tea, forced herself to eat a meal, even took a long, deep breath when she could feel the anxiety creeping up again. None of it felt easy. Each moment was a challenge. But with each small victory, Clara started to feel something inside her begin to shift, ever so slightly. It was as if her body, her mind, and her spirit were slowly learning to trust again. Trust in the possibility that she could move through this, even if she didn't know how. The steps were small, imperceptible to anyone else, but they were real to her. She didn't have the answers. She didn't have a plan, but she was making the decision, every single day, to keep moving forward. And that, she realized, was the beginning. The first steps into the abyss were the hardest. The fear, the uncertainty, the pain, they all threatened to swallow her whole. But Clara kept walking. One step at a time, she moved into the unknown, knowing that the only way out was through. Clara felt as though something inside her chest had cracked open, a gap that widened with each passing day. The impact of the tragedy hadn't just been physical, it was emotional too, and the pain she carried was something that seemed impossible to heal. Every step, every breath, felt like it pierced through the crack in her heart, as if simply existing was an unbearable effort. Life, which had once been full of color and sound, now seemed draped in a heavy, suffocating darkness. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. Her face was tired, drained of the life it once held. The woman in the reflection seemed foreign, a stranger to herself. Her eyes, once bright with hope and laughter, now felt distant and empty. The weight of grief, of loss, pressed down on her chest like a heavy stone, making it hard to breathe, to think, to feel anything but pain. It was as if the sorrow she carried had seeped into her very bones, every part of her aching with an intensity that left no room for anything else. But it wasn't just the emotional pain that tormented her. The physical toll it was taking on her body was undeniable. She felt weak, drained, her muscles constantly tight, as if she was always bracing for something, always waiting for the next blow. Even the simplest tasks, once automatic, now felt overwhelming. Walking across the room, making a meal, even getting out of bed, all of it seemed like a monumental task. Clara's body was in revolt, mirroring the turmoil inside her. It felt as if her pain was no longer just in her heart, but had taken root in every part of her being. The pressure in her chest, that constant feeling of tightness, reminded her of the emotional weight she carried. The pain, both physical and emotional, seemed inseparable, feeding into each other, making everything feel like too much. Every thought was a reminder of her vulnerability, a reminder of the hole inside her that seemed to grow deeper and deeper the more she tried to ignore it. She tried to push through, to tell herself that she was okay, that she would get through this, but it felt like a lie, like a mask she wore to fool herself and everyone around her. The truth was, Clara didn't know how to fix the cracks inside her. How could she? She didn't even know where to begin. She didn't know if she could heal from this, if she could ever be the person she was before. And that, more than anything, terrified her. She was afraid of being broken beyond repair, afraid that the pain would never let go. But one day, as Clara sat quietly by the window, staring at the world outside, something shifted. For the first time, she let herself feel the full extent of the gap in her heart. She let herself acknowledge the depth of the wound she carried. It wasn't easy. It wasn't comfortable. But it was necessary. She had spent so much time avoiding the pain, trying to run from it, that she had forgotten what it was. Like to just sit with it, to let it be a part of her, without trying to push it away. As she sat there, Clara realized something important. The gap in her heart wasn't a void that would consume her. It was a place where growth could happen. It wasn't about forgetting or erasing the pain, but learning how to carry it, how to live with it. The crack inside her wasn't a weakness. It was a part of her story, a part of who she was becoming. And with that realization came a new understanding. Healing wouldn't come in the form of fixing what was broken, but in accepting that the brokenness was just another part of being human. It was okay to hurt. It was okay to be imperfect. The fateful realization came like a whisper in the dark. The cracks in her heart were not the end of her story. They were the beginning of something new. Something that didn't require her to be perfect, but to be real. Something that didn't demand she erase the past, but that she allow herself to heal, in her own time, in her own way. And for the first time in a long while, Clara felt a glimmer of peace. It wasn't the absence of pain, but the acceptance of it. She knew the gap in her heart wouldn't disappear overnight, but she also knew that with time, she could learn to live with it. And in doing so, she could find strength, and maybe even beauty, in the very place where she had once thought only emptiness could reside. Life has a peculiar way of surprising us. Clara was still lost in the turmoil of her emotions, but something in the air was about to change. It was just another ordinary afternoon, a day when she could barely distinguish whether the sun was really shining or if the shadow of her sadness was clouding everything around her. She was walking down the street, her steps slow and heavy, as if each meter she covered was a massive effort. The world seemed to keep rushing by, while she remained in her pain, disconnected from everything and everyone. Then, something changed. Something that, in that moment, felt so insignificant, but would later become the turning point for everything to come. Clara was walking down a busy street, her gaze fixed on the pavement, when she bumped into a woman. The collision wasn't hard, but it was enough to stop Clara in her tracks, like an invitation to something different. The woman looked at her with a gentle smile, so simple, yet it made the world seem a little less dark. "Excuse me, are you okay?" The woman's voice, soft and full of concern, was like a light breaking through the darkness. Clara looked up at her, somewhat startled. She didn't know how to react. Those words, so simple, but so full of genuine care, made her pause. The woman looked at her with an expression that was both kind and understanding, and for a moment, everything around Clara stopped. It was as though this stranger had somehow seen her, really seen her, in a way that she hadn't allowed anyone else to. "I'm okay," Clara responded, but her voice was a weak attempt to convince herself. She wasn't okay. But who would be? The woman, noticing the hesitation in Clara's voice, took a small step forward. "Is there anything I can do for you?" she asked, with a calmness that Clara didn't expect, but that somehow made her feel like she might be safe to open up, even just a little. Something about the woman, something about that brief encounter, made Clara think that maybe, just maybe, she could let her guard down. And before she realized it, she found herself saying, "I don't know where to start." The words came out awkwardly, but they were there. The woman didn't press her to speak more. She didn't ask for details. She just stood there, offering a presence, a silent understanding that somehow allowed Clara to breathe. Clara wasn't used to this. People who simply saw her without expecting anything in return. She was used to pushing people away, hiding her pain from the world. But this woman, this stranger, offered her something different. Kindness, without question or judgment. Over the next few weeks, Clara and the woman ran into each other several more times. Clara never learned her name at first, but the quiet moments shared between them were enough. They didn't speak about anything too deep or profound. It wasn't about the words. They were just small, almost inconsequential moments of human connection. Sitting together at a cafe, walking through the park, exchanging a simple smile and a nod. It was those small gestures that started to mean something. Clara realized that, in these brief encounters, she was beginning to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. A glimmer of hope. It wasn't just the woman who made these unexpected appearances in Clara's life. Gradually, Clara started to notice other small encounters. Things that before would have gone unnoticed. A friend she hadn't spoken to in months reached out. A kind word from a colleague at work. A stranger offering her a smile on a difficult day. Every interaction, no matter how brief, began to feel like a sign. A small thread of connection pulling her back to the world. It was as if life, in its own quiet way, was nudging her forward, offering help, even when she hadn't asked for it. And it wasn't just people. Clara found herself drawn to situations that felt like they were waiting for her. One afternoon, while out for a solitary walk, she found herself standing in front of a small bookstore she had never noticed before. Something inside her, maybe it was a whisper from the universe, nudged her inside. She wandered through the aisles, and there, in the back, a book caught her eye. Healing with Silence. It was a simple title. Nothing extravagant, but something about it felt important. Without thinking, she picked it up, and in the weeks that followed, the words in that book helped Clara to see her pain in a new light. It wasn't the cure she had been hoping for, but it was a step, a shift in how she viewed her journey. And as Clara continued to move through the days, one after another, she began to realize that these unexpected encounters, whether with people or with moments, were what kept her going. They weren't grand gestures or life-changing events, but they were small beacons of light in a world that had once seemed dark and overwhelming. They were reminders that no one truly walks alone, even when they feel like they're at their lowest. The universe, in its own quiet way, was helping her piece together the shattered fragments of her life, one tiny, unexpected moment at a time. She had been surrounded by darkness for so long, and yet, it was in these small encounters, these little acts of kindness and connection, that Clara began to find the strength to keep going. Clara was beginning to realize something she had never noticed before. The greatest strength wasn't found in grand victories, miraculous solutions, or easy answers. True strength lay in the small, subtle details, those little things that, over time, began to spark hope within her. It was as though the universe was slowly whispering to her, "You can still find beauty, even in pain." One morning, Clara woke up earlier than usual. The soft morning light filtered through her curtains, casting a warm, golden glow on everything around her. For a moment, she simply sat on the edge of her bed, looking around the room. Everything seemed softer somehow, more peaceful. The quiet of the morning felt comforting, like a gentle embrace. She couldn't remember the last time she had taken a moment to simply exist, to feel the quiet peace that surrounded her. The noise of the world seemed distant, and in that stillness, she found something she hadn't been able to hear for a long time. Her own thoughts, her own breath, the simple act of being. She got out of bed and went into the kitchen, almost on autopilot. But this time she noticed everything. The smell of coffee brewing, the warmth of the mug in her hands, the quiet clink of the spoon. Stirring. The simple act of making coffee felt different, almost sacred. It was as though she had rediscovered a small ritual, a small act of care that she had once overlooked. For so long, she had been rushing through her days, but now, she allowed herself to experience each step, each sensation. There was comfort in the ordinary. As she sat down at the kitchen table, Clara looked out the window. In the garden, she saw a small flower, tucked away in the corner, almost hidden by the leaves. It was a delicate flower, nothing extravagant, but something about it caught her eye. She had passed by it so many times before, never noticing it. But today, it stood out to her, vibrant and beautiful in its simplicity. Clara found herself smiling, not because she was happy in the way she once was, but because she had found something worth smiling at. A small, quiet reminder that there was still beauty in the world. It wasn't just the flower. Throughout the day, Clara began to notice other small details that had once gone unnoticed. The sound of the wind through the trees, the way the sunlight hit the sidewalk in the afternoon, the laughter of children playing in the distance. All these little moments, so simple and so easily overlooked, began to fill her with a quiet sense of gratitude. It was as if the world, in all its small ways, was reminding her that even in her pain, there was still light to be found. And these small moments began to add up. As Clara went through the days, she started to see how much of her life had been filled with tiny, quiet gifts, things she had taken for granted, things she had never really given herself permission to enjoy. Each little thing was a thread of connection to the world, a thread of hope that, slowly but surely, started to weave her back into the fabric of life. One day, while walking through the park, Clara sat on a bench and watched an elderly woman tending to a small community garden. The woman wasn't doing anything remarkable, just planting flowers and pulling up weeds. But there was something so peaceful in the way she worked. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't trying to accomplish something huge. She was simply doing what she loved, finding joy in the smallest of tasks. Clara realized that this was what she needed to do. Take the time to care for the small things, to nurture what was still alive inside of her, no matter how broken it seemed. The elderly woman didn't need to do anything grand to create beauty. She just needed to be present, to be patient, and to let the small acts of care transform the space around her. Clara began to embrace this idea, allowing herself to slow down, to pay attention to the small details of her life. She no longer rushed through the days, trying to fix everything at once. Instead, she took each moment for what it was, finding strength in the act of simply being present. She started to take care of herself in small ways, by resting when she needed to, by eating meals that nourished, her, by walking outside to feel the sunlight on her face. These small acts, once insignificant, began to become the foundation of her healing. The more she focused on the small things, the more Clara realized that they were what gave her the strength to keep going. It wasn't about achieving some big, monumental change. It was about finding joy, even in the smallest moments, and allowing those moments to rebuild her, piece by piece. The journey of healing was not a race. It was a series of quiet steps, of noticing the world around her, of allowing herself to feel the comfort of life's simple details. And as Clara sat in her garden, watching the flowers sway gently in the breeze, she realized that the greatest strength wasn't in the big, dramatic changes, but in the quiet, everyday moments. The world was still full of beauty, and all she had to do was stop and let herself see it. The strength she had been searching for was there, in the little things, and with each one she noticed, she grew stronger, little by little. It was nighttime when Clara found herself alone again, this time in her bedroom. The darkness of the room seemed to reflect the depth of her soul, as if the very walls of the space absorbed all the anguish and fear she carried. She lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, which seemed to move slowly in her gaze. The tears had stopped coming. They had already been shed, and despite all the pain, part of her felt empty. Not because there was no more sorrow, but because somehow the emotional exhaustion was greater. Clara had walked through many days in those dark corridors within herself. She had tried in every way to find strength to get up, but with each step, it seemed the fall was even closer. She thought she might give up, that maybe it would be easier to stop, to let herself be consumed by the pain until everything faded away. But in that moment, something inside her rebelled. She was tired, yes, but there was a flame, a small flame inside her, that was not ready to burn out. That flame felt weak, almost insignificant, but it was still there, burning slowly. She turned to her side and closed her eyes. The silence of the night seemed to invade every part of her being, but then a reflection came quietly into her mind. What would happen if I gave up now? If I just let everything go and gave in to the pain? The idea of giving up tugged at her, but something deep in her soul refused to surrender. It would not be this way. It couldn't be this way. It was as if a part of her, older, stronger, was trying to speak to her, trying to awaken her from the stupor. You've come this far. You've already overcome so much. And now you want to give up? The inner voice, small but firm, questioned her. Clara felt a lump in her throat. She didn't know how to answer. She didn't know how to argue with that quiet, steady strength. The truth was, she had overcome so much. She had faced the impossible. She was still here, breathing, even though the weight of her grief seemed more than she could carry. The path had not been easy, and she knew it wouldn't be easier moving forward. But at that moment, she also knew there was something inside her that wouldn't give up. Giving up is not an option. The words echoed in her mind, firm and resolute. Not because she wanted to ignore the pain, but because she knew that if she succumbed to it, it would be the end. And she wasn't ready for that. She wasn't ready to give up. I'm not made to give up. Those words became clearer, louder, as if they were coming from her heart, projecting into her future. She didn't know how she would do it. She didn't know what the next steps would be, but she knew that giving up wasn't an option. Not anymore. With each passing day, Clara began to realize that her decision to move forward was not based on promises of perfection or that everything would be okay. It was based on the acceptance that even with pain, she could still keep going. I am stronger than this pain. I am stronger than this doubt. She found herself repeating those words, almost like a silent mantra, as she walked to the window, looking out at the dark sky. The horizon, invisible in the night, was still there, waiting, and so was she. Not by chance, but because she had made the choice, in her heart, to keep moving. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about having all the answers. It was about finding the courage to keep going, even when everything inside her said to stop. Clara now knew that the real battle wasn't against the external pain, but against the strength of the will to remain alive, to remain strong, to stand tall. And at that moment, she made the choice. She wouldn't hide anymore. She wouldn't run. She would keep going. The sound of rain tapping against the windows was the only thing Clara heard as she sat alone in her living room. Time seemed slow, as if the world outside was out of sync with what she felt inside. She lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel everything. She wasn't sure exactly how, but something inside her was shifting. She was beginning to understand that healing wouldn't be a quick or easy process, but rather one that required patience, acceptance, and above all, a deep commitment to herself. Clara started to realize that she couldn't simply ignore the scars, the emotional wounds that were deeply embedded within her. For so long she had tried to push them away, to bury them in a hidden corner of her mind. But now she knew. Ignoring them wouldn't make them go away. They were there, alive, shaping her choices, her thoughts, her actions. She had to face them, one day at a time. The first step was the hardest. It was as if Clara was opening a door to a narrow, dark hallway, an unknown space she had never wanted to explore. She found herself looking inward, trying to understand the pain she was feeling, the source of her wounds, both physical and emotional, the sleepless nights, the constant fatigue, the aches in her body. She now saw these as reflections of what she had not healed. The pain she felt in her heart was spilling into her body, becoming a burden she carried without even realizing. The process of healing began with acceptance. Clara had to accept that she was wounded. Accept that as much as she wanted to be whole, she was broken. But at the same time, she knew that this acceptance didn't mean weakness. Quite the opposite. She was finally allowing herself to be human, allowing herself to feel the pain in order to release the weight she had been carrying. Every tear that fell, every breath that became difficult, was a small release, a way to rid herself of something that had bound her. In the beginning, Clara felt lost. She woke up not knowing exactly what to do with herself. There was no manual for getting over what she was facing, no step-by-step guide to heal from within. But as the days passed, something began to shift. She began to realize that by allowing herself to feel, she was, in fact, healing. The small victories were the most important. A smile in the mirror in the morning, the simple act of making a meal without feeling completely empty, the ability to take a long, deep breath when anxiety crept in. These little actions began to form the foundation of her recovery. Clara began therapy, talking with a professional who helped her understand her emotions, guiding her on how to handle the pain without drowning in it. But the journey wasn't easy. There were days when frustration took over, when she found herself trapped in the same cycle of sadness and grief. She wanted the process to be faster. She wanted healing to be something tangible, something she could control. But the truth was, healing wasn't linear. Sometimes, she took 2 steps forward, then 1 step back. That was hard for her, but she learned to be gentle with herself, to allow space for mistakes, for setbacks, without judgment. At some point, Clara started doing more for herself. She signed up for yoga classes, something she had always wanted to try but never had the courage to do. At first, her movements were stiff, forced, and she felt awkward in her own body. But little by little, she started to feel relief. Each deep breath, each stretch, seemed to release a bit of the pain she was holding. She allowed herself to be vulnerable, to disconnect from everything that weighed her down, and reconnect with her body, with the present moment. It was in that space of stillness that Clara began to realize that healing was happening. She was reconnecting with parts of herself that she had lost, parts that she didn't know how to find. The hardest part was accepting that, in the process of healing, Clara would have to leave many things behind, She would have to let go of old beliefs that had held her back, let go of old wounds that kept her from moving forward. She didn't have to forget, but she did have to learn how to live with it without letting it define her. Healing wasn't about erasing the pain. It was about learning to live with it, to move forward despite it. Clara started to look at herself with more compassion, to see herself as a strong woman who had overcome tragedy. She began to understand that the pain wasn't the end of her story, but rather a part of her transformation. Healing wasn't about achieving perfection, but about finding peace. Peace not from a life without pain, but from the ability to live with it in a healthy way, from learning to get back up every time she fell. In the silence, Clara allowed herself to smile, not because she was healed, but because she knew, in that moment, she was more whole than she had been in a long time. She had begun the journey of healing, and with every new step, she became stronger, more resilient, and more willing to love herself, no matter what she had been through. The sun was low on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and gold, and Clara, once again, found herself in the garden of her home. But this time, something inside her had shifted. She wasn't sure what exactly it was, but the world around her seemed more expansive, more full of possibilities. The days of uncertainty, of darkness, were beginning to fade into the background, and now, sitting there, watching the sunset, she knew that, despite not having a perfect plan or all the answers, she had taken one crucial step. She had learned to look at the future in a new way. She no longer saw it as a place filled with fear and unknowns, but as a space where she could reinvent herself, where there was room for new dreams, new stories. She stood up and began walking slowly, not in a hurry, but absorbing every detail around her. The sound of the leaves in the wind, the golden glow of the trees, the long shadows stretching across the ground. They all seemed more intense, more present. Before, she would have hurried past it, all not noticing. But now, every small detail seemed to carry new meaning. Clara allowed herself to be here, in the moment, feeling life more deeply, without rushing to leave it behind. She started to realize what really mattered, the things she had once neglected. And most importantly, she began to see the beauty that existed in life's simplest moments. She remembered how often she had gotten lost in thoughts about what could have been, about what she thought she had lost. For so long, she had focused on the gaps, on the faults in her path. But now, she began to see that, no matter how deep the scars, they were also a part of her story. They were marks of her survival, not her weakness. The pain had changed her, yes, but it had also taught her to be stronger, more conscious, more grateful. She didn't need to forget the wounds to move forward, but she could learn to walk with them, to use them as fuel to grow. And it was there, in that quiet moment of connection with nature and with herself, that Clara understood. She was no longer a victim of the past. She had made peace with the pain. She had found the strength to see life not as something to be feared, but as something to be embraced. The future, once a dusty and dark road, now seemed clear, not as a way without obstacles, but as a place where she had the power to plant her seeds and nurture them with patience and hope. Clara now realized that the future wasn't a promise of perfection, but an opportunity to begin. Again, every day, if that was what was needed. She could have lost much, but she hadn't lost the ability to create, to transform, to reinvent herself. She smiled at the horizon, and the smile wasn't one of sadness or resignation, but of peace. She knew that, from that moment on, nothing would be the same. Life, with all its imperfections, was now a gift that she was ready to embrace, to live with gratitude and courage. Clara had something now that she hadn't had before, a renewed purpose, a mission she couldn't yet fully define, but one that she felt with all her being. She was here, not to survive, but to live with intensity, to show herself and the world that there was always a second chance, always a new opportunity to start again, even when everything seemed lost. Clara's rebirth wasn't a magical event, nor a grand happening. It was the miracle of life renewing itself every second, in the strength of small steps, in the power of getting up after each fall, in the decision to never give up, even when it seemed impossible. She now understood that life was never about avoiding pain, but learning how to move through it. And, little by little, she began to see her pain not as an end, but as the bridge to a new beginning. The road ahead was still unknown, but Clara knew that she was no longer afraid. She was ready for whatever came next. And as she gazed at the stars in the sky, Clara felt something within her light up. The future was no longer threatening her peace. It was inviting her to walk toward it. The sun was setting on the horizon, but Clara knew that, with the dawn, she would be ready for whatever came next. She had learned to see life with new eyes that no longer saw pain as an end, but as a stepping stone toward the person she was becoming. And that person, Clara realized, was stronger, braver, and more alive than she had ever been before. The winter had finally given way to spring. Clara looked at herself, in silence, and realized that, without even noticing, she had transformed. She was no longer the woman who woke up with the weight of grief on her shoulders, who dragged herself through life, searching for something to make her feel alive again. Now, she saw herself differently. A woman who had walked through fire, who remade herself with every fall, who had discovered that in the end, the greatest strength wasn't in avoiding pain, but in allowing yourself to be reborn with every new dawn. She stood on top of a hill, the wind gently brushing against her face, and the world seemed to open up before her eyes. The sky now seemed wider, more luminous, as if her whole being had been illuminated by a new perspective. The past, the losses, the wounds, those things that once defined her, now only felt like remnants of her journey, not the chapter that determined her life. She was here, sitting, watching the day fade away, and for the first time, she knew, despite not having a perfect plan or all the answers, that everything had changed. She had begun to learn how to look toward the future in a new light. She no longer saw it as a place filled with uncertainties and fears, but as a space where she could reinvent herself, where there was room for new dreams, new stories. She stood up and started walking slowly, not in a rush, but absorbing everything around her. The sound of the leaves in the wind, the golden glow of the trees, the long shadows stretching across the ground. They all seemed more intense, more present. Before, she would have rushed past it all, not noticing. But now, every little detail seemed to hold new meaning. Clara allowed herself to be here, in the moment, feeling life more deeply, without rushing to leave it behind. She began to realize what truly mattered, the things she had once neglected. And most importantly, she began to see the beauty that existed in life's simplest moments. She remembered how often she had gotten lost in thoughts about what could have been, about what she thought she had lost. For so long, she had focused on the gaps, on the flaws in her path. But now she began to see that, no matter how deep the scars, they were also a part of her story. They were marks of her survival, not her weakness. The pain had changed her, yes, but it had also taught her to be stronger, more conscious, more grateful. She didn't need to forget the wounds to move forward, but she could learn to walk with them, to use them as fuel to grow. And it was there, in that quiet moment of connection with nature and with herself, that Clara understood. She was no longer a victim of the past. She had made peace with the pain. She had found the strength to see life not as something to be feared, but as something to be embraced. The future, once a dusty and dark road, now seemed clear, not as a way without obstacles, but as a place where she had the power to plant her seeds and nurture them with patience and hope. Clara now realized that the future wasn't a promise of perfection, but an opportunity to begin again, every day, if that was what was needed. She could have lost much, but she hadn't lost the ability to create, to transform, to reinvent herself. She smiled at the horizon, and the smile wasn't one of sadness or resignation, but of peace. She knew that, from that moment on, nothing would be the same. Life, with all its imperfections, was now a gift that she was ready to embrace, to live with gratitude and courage. Clara had something now that she hadn't had before, a renewed purpose, a mission she couldn't yet fully define, but one that she felt with all her being. She was here, not to survive, but to live with intensity, to show herself and the world that there was always a second chance, always a new opportunity to start again, even when everything seemed lost. Clara's rebirth wasn't a magical event, nor a grand happening. It was the miracle of life renewing itself every second, in the strength of small steps, in the power of getting up after each fall, in the decision to never give up, even when it seemed impossible. She now understood that life was never about avoiding pain, but learning how to move through it. And little by little, she began to see her pain not as an end, but as the bridge to a new beginning. The road ahead was still unknown, but Clara knew that she was no longer afraid. She was ready for whatever came next. And as she gazed at the stars in the sky, Clara felt something within her light up. The future was no longer threatening her peace. It was inviting her to walk toward it. The sun was setting on the horizon, but Clara knew that with the dawn, she would be ready for whatever came next. She had learned to see life with new eyes that no longer saw pain as an end, but as a stepping stone toward the person she was becoming. And that person, Clara realized, was stronger, braver, and more alive than she had ever been before.